Hello and welcome everybody. Happy Friday. Hope everyone is having a lovely week, is ready for another weekend. But first, another Sectors Made Simple Subsector Spotlight. Today, I have a very interesting topic to share with you all, because this one doesn't come from a list of sectors or industries that I feel like would be fun to cover. This one comes from current events. It's a subject that is not just an investment at the moment. It's an entire conversation and for many, an issue that they are aware of. But it's also impacting the market in a very, very interesting way. So before we get into the subsector spotlight, I want to show you all something very fascinating. So I want to go really quickly over to my other screen, and I want to take a look at FinViz together. So if we look at FinViz and we go to groups and we sort by industry, the 1 week, this is for every single industry there is. Let's look at where energy industries are. Energy, 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 energy. All of the top industries at the moment are from the energy sector. So the conversation today is not just going to be about oil and natural gas, but it's about why we're seeing all of these energy industries skyrocketing, not even just doing well, skyrocketing. There is a reason, and today I want to show you some of what those reasons are, and of course we'll go through the usual subsector spotlight stuff, such as key companies and ETFs that give exposure to oil and oil production and natural gas production. So I want to get straight into the webinar, but first, hello to everyone we have with us live. As always, we do these webinars live every Friday at 4 p.m. Los Angeles time, 7 p.m. Eastern time. So hello Emelida, Blanca, Ramiro, Lucia, Delia, Ermila, my mother, Elizabeth, Chela, Kira, Yesenia, Nancy, Meli, Kike, Eddie, Gerardo, Laura, Sarah, Miguel, Alicia, and so many more. It's great to see you all. Let's get straight into the action. Usual disclaimer, I'm going to talk about a bunch of investment stuff, mostly pertaining to information about the industry, what the companies are, and some of the challenges that the industry faces. All of this is as factual as I can find. However, mistakes happen, and most importantly, prices change. So please take everything here as an educational resource, not as investment advice. So let's first look at what the oil and gas industry actually is. So the oil and gas industry is one of the most valuable industries in the entire world if we're looking at the value of it, so how much money it produces. According to this data source, IBIS, the oil and gas industry in 2020 generated 3.3 trillion US dollars. That is huge. That is a massive industry. The oil and gas industry includes 3 major parts: upstream, midstream, and downstream. Some, and by some I mean most of the companies you are probably familiar with in oil and gas, do all 3, upstream, midstream, and downstream, in a category that is known as integrated. If any of you were in, hopefully many of you were in our supply chain webinar, we talked about this idea of being vertically integrated. This idea that one company does everything from the research to the extraction to the processing to the transportation to the refining. They do it all so that they save money by not needing to pay someone else to do the work that they could do. So many of the companies you're familiar with, and most of the largest oil and gas companies, are integrated. So we'll talk about those here in a little bit. But others choose to focus on only one or two, mostly just one, part of the supply chain. So I want to make sure that we know exactly what these three groups are. First is going to be upstream. Upstream is often called, not upstream, but instead exploration and production, or E&P. E&P includes finding oil deposits, getting drilling permits and rights, pipeline permits if needed, and extracting oil out of the ground and getting it to the surface where it can then be used. Of the three different groups, exploration and production is extremely high risk, high reward. Oftentimes, it requires amazingly complex computer programs to find where the deposits are, and it's expensive. It's time consuming and it's expensive to find all of these different locations. Each failed attempt, so where they drill and they don't find anything, or rather they sample and they don't find anything, or each failed attempt to find a drilling site costs anywhere from $5 to $20 million. And I know what some of you are probably thinking. Well, these oil deposits are huge, so once you find one, no big deal, right? Not exactly. The exploration part is oftentimes a challenge, because think about it like a big piece of Swiss cheese. All of those little pockets inside of the cheese are the oil deposits. Each one is not very large. There are some huge ones in the world, but most of them are smaller pockets that what they will do is once they find a lot of oil deposits, or maybe 4 or 5 to up to 10, they will drill a hole in between two of the deposits to make one giant one. So they only need to have one drill or one drilling location to pull many deposits. So while it might seem like $5 to $20 million is not terrible, if you're setting up a 10 deposit drill, that's $50 to $200 million when you fail. And don't forget, that's only when you it's not just if you fail. So it's not like, oh, you got the answer wrong, there's the bill. They're paying that regardless. So they're paying that if they succeed, but also if they fail. So it gets pretty pricey pretty quick just to find where it is. Forget even trying to pull it out of the ground. But they've found a location, permits are granted, now drilling can begin. Drilling can occur in one of two places. One if by land, two if by sea, right? They can be on land, which is onshore, or over the water, which is offshore. What's fascinating is many of you have probably seen these massive oil rigs in the ocean. These huge, giant platforms that pull oil from the seafloor thousands of feet below them. What if I told you that most of those are portable? Once they're done drilling, they don't just leave it there. Many of them, they just pick it up. They literally have a giant boat that goes and picks up an oil rig. Let me see if I can find a picture of this because it is hysterical. This is what it looks like. That is a boat that carries an oil rig. And what it does is it sinks itself, brings itself down, puts itself underneath the oil rig, and then lets all of the water out so it starts floating again. And you can literally just lift an oil rig just like that. And yes, there's still the big stands that are left there, but the actual drill portion of it, they just lift up and move it to the next location. So it's pretty fascinating the technology that this industry has created. These boats sink themselves and then lift themselves back up to pull the drill to the next place it's needed. Fun fact, SpaceX is actually buying a bunch of those old decommissioned oil rigs because they want to use them as launch pads for Starship. But SpaceX is private and not the topic for today, although they do use rocket fuel. Let's now talk about midstream. So we just talked about upstream, the exploration and production side of things. Now, we've got the oil out of the ground, we've got the gas out of the ground. Congratulations, it now needs to go somewhere. We can't use crude oil, we can't use raw natural gas. It needs to be refined and cleaned and turned into something that we can then use. So that's where midstream comes in. Midstream involves transporting the oil and gas from where it's extracted to where it's going to be refined. To do this, they will use traditional methods of transportation, trucks, and container ships, and pipelines, of course, to move oil from where it's extracted to where it will be refined. These companies are oftentimes also responsible for storing natural gas and crude oil. You might think that it's the job of the extractor to hold on to it until someone needs it. But instead, many of these companies will just buy oil, and then shove it in, well, many different places. One of the most common, funny enough, is old oil deposits. They're going to pull crude oil out of the ground, transport it, and then shove it back into the ground because it's cheap and easy. They don't need to dig it, the hole is already there. So that is the midstream side of things. It is transporting oil and gas from where it's extracted to where it'll be used. But this is also where the most risk comes in. There is a lot of risk that happens when you're transporting oil and gas, which are very dangerous materials. They are very flammable, so they can catch fire very easily. And there are also huge risks that these materials have for the environment. So there's a lot of regulation, a lot of rules, and a lot of oversight to make sure that all of these materials are transported safely and are stored safely. Now, this brings us all the way down to downstream. Downstream is where the crude oil and natural gas get turned into things that we can use. Because oil taken from the ground is basically useless. It's contaminated, it's not clean, and it's not good for any one thing in particular. So instead, what we'll do is we're going to refine it. We'll take this raw oil and turn it into something different, something better. Crude oil can be refined to make things such as diesel fuel, heating oil, lubricating oils for manufacturing, as well as asphalt that we use to pave our roads. Natural gas can be used for heating our homes, chemical manufacturing, fertilizer, and hydrogen production. Now, this is where things get a little more touchy, I'll say. Refining and consuming oils creates a massive amount of harmful emissions. It is really bad for the environment and also really bad for us. So refining and consumption of oil and gas products is where a lot of smog and pollution in cities comes from. It comes from the cars that are running on diesel and gasoline. It comes from the factories that are consuming oil. It comes from the energy plants that are burning oil or gas, it comes from a number of places, and none of them really help the environment. Let's just say it like that. Now, when we're talking about how to measure how much stuff something's producing or how much stuff they're selling, we need units of measurement. We need a way of saying how much of this thing. So what we can do is we can put oil and gas into numbers or figures that we can track and, more importantly, price. There is no one standardized way of saying how much gas we have. So here are the best ones that we have. Oil is easy. Oil is measured in barrels. 1 barrel of oil is 44 US gallons. You've probably seen them all before. They're the giant drums that are oftentimes filled with very, very, very heavy liquid. Then, natural gas is the one that there's not really a single metric. So instead, what we have for natural gas is BTUs, or British Thermal Units. We also have cubic feet, which is how much space does that gas take up. This one is not as commonly used. It's mostly meant for extraction. They'll talk about cubic feet for extraction. But when you're measuring how much you're selling or how much the price of natural gas is, it's oftentimes seen in British thermal units, often measured in millions. So, millions of BTU. When you look at the cost of oil, what we're going to look at here, because oil is a commodity, so we need to track it a little bit differently. It's not a share price. So instead, the way that they price oil is by looking at various benchmarks. These benchmarks tell us what type of oil, the refinement level, and the general use for it. Brent blend, which is a UK benchmark, is one of the most common when it comes to pricing oil. And as of today, the current price of the Brent blend oil barrel is $79.20 per barrel. Henry Hub is one of the 3 most common gas pricing benchmarks, currently valued at around $4 per million British thermal units, or BTU. Fun fact, if you have a gas range or cooktop in your house, chances are it has a rating for BTU. How much gas does it use? So now you know. You can match up how much gas your stove uses to the price per million BTU to understand how much it costs for you to run your stove. Do you need to do that? Probably not, but it's cool to know that you could. Now, let's talk about the suppliers, because we can't even get to companies yet. Before we get to companies, we need to talk about cartels and organizations. Oil and gas production are highly regulated by not just the governments that try and make sure it's transported safely and extracted safely and refined safely, but in how much is even refined, extracted, transported, and all of that. These international organizations try to maximize their profit because, after all, oil and gas are natural resources. A country wants to make sure that they are getting the best value for something they are pulling out of the ground and selling. So these cartels try to manage how much money each barrel is worth or each BTU is worth by not changing the price in the market, but instead changing the supply in the market. Think about it like this. Our demand for oil and gas changes. It's a bit higher for gas in the winter because we need to heat our homes. Might be oil's a little bit higher in the summer. They know this. So what they will do is they will lower, so this right here, let's do this is supply, this is demand. Our demand, let's say, is right here. What they will do is they will lower the supply so that the demand maybe is just a bit below the supply, but there's not a lot extra. Because there's not a lot extra, we're going to want to pay more to make sure we can get the oil and gas we need. Let's say our demand goes down. All of a sudden, supply is still very high, demand is now lower. So the price is going to go down because we don't need as much. Because we don't need as much, we're not going to be willing to pay as much money for it. So what these organizations do is they always try and move their supply to be close to the demand, to make sure that they are getting the absolute best prices they can for their representative countries. They change the demand, they change the supply based on the demand. And the unfortunate thing is we rely on them to do this. Yeah, we might like it if they don't change how much they're producing and now we need less oil. And I'll talk about that here in a little bit. But what we're seeing today is the opposite problem. We need so much more gas and so much more oil, and they're not producing more. So the price is skyrocketing, but at a certain point, money can't make oil appear out of nowhere. So what the heck are we going to do? Before we get into what we're going to do or what could be done about it, let's talk about the biggest cartel there is. The Organization of Petroleum Producing Companies, Exporting Companies, OPEC. OPEC has a single goal. Manage how much oil different countries produce in an attempt to make it so no country is overproducing. When no one is overproducing, there's no competition in the market. If all of the farmers get together and say, we're only going to sell corn for $10 per pound, that's some expensive corn, but $10 per pound, you can't say, oh, I don't like your price, let me go say hi to Juan. Juan's going to say $10 a pound. All right, forget you, let's go talk to Maria. Maria says $10 a pound. When everyone has the exact same price, there's no competition. And that's what OPEC's goal is. Make it so there's no competition, so you need to pay whatever OPEC says a barrel is worth. That's not great for us. So let's actually talk about what countries are in OPEC, because it's probably not the ones you're thinking of. There probably are going to be a bunch you are thinking of, but some, maybe not. Algeria, Angola, Equatorial Guinea, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Libya, Nigeria, Republic of the Congo, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates or UAE, Venezuela. In total, these countries, these 12 countries, produce 35.5 million barrels of oil a day. That is an absolutely insane number. That's per day. Now, there are two big countries here that are not listed, that are huge, huge producers of oil. Russia, US. Neither of those countries are part of OPEC. And that'll come in handy, that piece of information will come in handy later on. But for right now, let's talk about the biggest issue that's not related to the economy, but is related to oil in general and natural gas in general. Spills and leaks. This is by far one of the biggest dangers in this entire industry, where one accident can cause massive and irreparable environmental damage. These mistakes or damages in the supply chain not only result in a lower amount of oil in the world, but create massive spills that damage wildlife, kill fish and marine animals, damage birds, and overall has an unbelievably horrible effect on the environment. And the worst part is, these spills, they don't just take a lot of money, they take a lot of time to clean up. And in that time, a lot of the damage can spread to countries that had no involvement in this. For example, if there was an oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, the US is going to be affected, Mexico is going to be affected. But many countries in South America would as well. The entire north side of South America and Brazil would be affected. Europe might get a little affected. Africa definitely would feel some of it. The oceans are connected. Our world is connected by oceans. So a spill in the ocean is going to spread across the globe. Let's talk about one of the most well-known spills in recent history. The BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. In 2010, an accident on the BP drilling platform called Deepwater Horizon caused a spill of 134 million gallons of oil into the Gulf of Mexico. This damage was not just environmental. It spread oil to beaches in Africa, North America, and South America. The estimated cost for the cleanup? Well, first off, the time for the cleanup took about 5 years for them to clean up everything. The cost? Estimated around 17.2 billion US dollars. Now that obviously is one of the largest ones. But there are dozens of well-known historical oil spills that have had massive negative impacts, both in the Atlantic as well as the Pacific. On average, there are 2 oil spills every year that result in more than 700 tons of oil leaking out into the environment. And the funny part is, this is the best it's ever been. If we just go back to the 1970s, 50 years ago, this number was 20. 20 700-ton oil disasters every year, on average. That's terrifying. Thankfully, we've gotten a little bit better since then. Safety has improved, technology has improved, but the environmental damage is still there. It kills environments for years and decades. And that's just the mistakes. That's only when things go wrong. But even when things go right, extracting, refining, and consuming oil and gas products has a horribly harmful effect on our environment. Fracking, a process used to extract oil and gas, damages nearby drinking water supplies, and if there are any floods, contaminates any water source nearby that extraction facility. When we have excess oil, that's fine, we shove it back into the ground. But when we have excess natural gas, oftentimes they'll just burn it. They'll just light it on fire and burn it in a flare stack. And those burn-offs create stupid amounts of greenhouse gases that damage our atmosphere. And even if everything goes right, Oil refining and usage generates large amounts of pollution and harmful chemicals that are responsible for smog and pollution that you see in most major cities, especially Eastern Asian cities. So with all of this, we have to ask the question, why do we still use them? Is this really a necessary evil in 2021? Do we still need to accept the dangers and damages that come from using oil and natural gas resources? Well, yes. Unfortunately, we do. Most things rely on oil and gas products to run. Cars, boats, planes, rockets, all rely on oil and gas products. Many production things, such as heavy machinery, rely on diesel fuels. Chemical reactions rely on many of the different natural gas products we create. And most importantly, our energy sources. Yes, clean energy is rising, but I'll tell you this, in the US, coal and oil are still the two most dominant forms of energy production, and in Europe, those numbers are hysterical. 75% of India's energy comes from only coal. The rest of it, about 20%, comes from oil. In China, they are one of the largest consumers of oil in the world and natural gas in the world because they use them to generate their electricity that powers many of the factories that we rely on for global supply chains. Some of these uses have obvious replacements. Clean energy, we can do solar, we can do uranium, we can do wind farms. Cars, yeah, we can have electric cars. Boats, we're probably not going to see electric cruise ships anytime soon. Electric planes, maybe a little bit sooner than electric cruise ships. Rockets, never going to happen. Just never going to happen. There are many things that we can replace with clean energy and electric power. But electric power doesn't really mean much when the way that power is created is still using dirty fuels. Coal, gas, oil. So we don't just need more electric cars, we need more electric energy generation. We need better alternatives for larger forms of transportation, such as airplanes and container ships. Container ships do not measure their miles per gallon in miles per gallon. Instead, they measure it in gallons per mile. So when a container ship that's going from China to Los Angeles is consuming 5 gallons per mile to make that trip, you start to see why, and that's a single container ship, you start to see why we are very, very far away from being able to go completely clean energy. And clean, not just energy for our houses or for our cars, I'm saying clean energy for our factories, for our main methods of global transportation, and more. And again, electricity is great, but that electricity still needs to be created somehow. And there are very few places in the world that the majority of their energy is created via solar, wind, and nuclear clean energy sources. So, as difficult as it is to say, yeah, oil and gas isn't going anywhere anytime soon, so we better learn to live with it. We're better off than we were 30, 40 years ago. Looking back to the 1980s, we had the first electric car. The idea of an electric car was so terrifying to the US government because we worried that a decreased reliance on Middle Eastern oil would cause us to go to war with the Middle East. That the US government took every single one of those electric cars, bought them all not so they could drive them, so they could crush them and destroy them. If you're ever interested, there is a documentary on this called Who Killed the Electric Car. It's a very, very fascinating look at the amount of control that oil used to have on our society. Thankfully, we've gotten better since then. The US has become a huge producer of oil, but we're still not perfect, and we're not going to be perfect anytime soon. So we still need to learn to live with oil and gas as it is. Now, before we go any further here, let's talk future. Stock prices and the price of oil companies, the prices of oil companies are measured by the current traded price for a share. Oil and gas, again, work a little differently. They're measured in BTUs or in barrels. But we're not looking at the price today like we do for a stock, where we say the price today is blah, 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 blah. Most oil and gas is not sold the day that it's needed. Oh, Erica, please, I'm not Mr. Stav. That is my father. I'm just Jonathan. Most oil and gas is not sold as a commodity today. Instead, it's sold in the form of futures contracts. Futures contracts are, think of an option that you say, I will buy so many shares of Tesla at $900 per share 3 weeks from now. But instead of having the option to execute that order whenever you want, instead, futures contracts say, on November 1st, you will buy 500 gallons of gas or 500 gallons of crude oil for $79 per barrel. There's a set date that the trade happens on. There is a set price, and there is a set amount. Let me show you the real numbers before we go too far into this. Right now, crude oil futures, so contracts that are due in November. So the money comes out and the oil comes in November, but the deal is signed today. These crude oil futures are trading at $75.88 for November, with December futures at $79.28. So we're seeing the price going up. Every single month it's going up, because with winter, our need for energy goes up, our need for heating goes up, and all of those require fuel. So the reason oil manufacturers do this is by selling contracts in the future. Remember how we talked about microchips and microprocessors take 1.5 to 2 years to make? So they need to estimate the demand 2 years from now? Here, they can estimate their demand 2 months from now. So they can produce just enough to fill their contracts for December. So they always know what the demand will be, and they'll produce a little extra just in case, to ensure that there is never a massive surplus of oil. That surplus of oil is a lot of lost profits, because now if there's too much oil, we don't want to spend as much per barrel. Because if we're not going to buy it from Juan, we can go buy it from Juanita or Maria down the street. So that is how it works in a perfect economy. Perfect economy for the oil manufacturers. What happens when the world changes and its demand for oil all of a sudden drops? That's what happened when COVID first hit. Back in April of 2020, on April 20th, futures for May crashed because all of a sudden COVID hit. factories shut down, global supply chains crippled, the entire world's demand for oil hit rock bottom. And with that demand going down, the issue did not become, can we consume all of this oil? The issue became, where do we put it? What happened was this. Oil producers had nowhere to put the oil. The midstream companies that were responsible for storing that oil ran out of space. So they started storing oil, not in tanks, not in pipelines, not in underground wells, but on boats. Literally, there was just oil sitting on boats doing nothing because there was no demand for it. So the price for these futures crashed, not to zero, to negative $37.63 per barrel. Or in other words, and this is not an exaggeration here, oil producers were paying you to take oil. They were paying you. They were literally saying, hey, we need to get rid of this oil. We'll pay you just so we don't need to store it anymore. That's what happened last year in April. And it is the exact reason why OPEC and other oil manufacturers are so careful about the supply and demand. Because this was an extreme case of what happens when supply and demand gets a little crazy. But that can happen on smaller scales as well. If all of a sudden OPEC produces double what they need to, all of a sudden there's twice as much oil, but the demand hasn't changed, so the price is going to crash. In this case, that supply was way higher than demand, so the price didn't just hit zero, it went negative. They were paying you to get it out of their ships and out of their tanks. So that was last year in April. Let's now talk, Jonathan, that happened due to COVID. Yes, it did. So COVID shut down a lot of factories and a lot of global industries. Transportation was the biggest one. All of the lockdowns reduced our need for petroleum for cars and other forms of transportation. So global demand for oil crashed, and because all of the supply is done a month or 3 months ahead of time, there was no time to correct. They couldn't all of a sudden not have that much oil or get rid of it somewhere. There's no real world delete button for oil. All they had to do was try and find people that would be willing to get paid to store the oil for all of these manufacturers. Let's now look, instead of what's happened in the past, let's look at our immediate future and why we are seeing all of these energy industries skyrocketing. Oil right now is in a massive boom because there's shortages of natural gas supplies in the world. Oil prices have skyrocketed, absolutely skyrocketed. At the beginning of 2021, the price for a barrel of oil was just $51, compared to the almost $80 that it is right now, and that price is going up every day. Typically, gas prices will peak in fall or early winter. So keep that in mind when I'm sharing these numbers, and it will show the importance of all of this. Hi Mario, great to see you. On October 2nd of last year, so as close as I could get to 1 year ago today, gas price was $2.46 per million BTU. Today, it is almost double. October 1st of 2021, gas prices are now at $5.55 per million BTU. oil prices have risen about 60%. Gas prices have risen about 90 to 95%. Those are not just small changes in market behavior. Those are massive spikes in price. So, why? What has happened that has caused, because this is not something immediate either, right? This is something that's been happening for weeks. Now we're just having it come to our attention because one major event happened earlier this week that led to the craziness that is today. The demand for oil has been returning over the past few months, where what we're running into is the global production returning to pre-COVID levels. Factories have a need for not just oil and gas for production or for byproducts or for production as an ingredient, but also they need energy. A lot of that machinery relies on electricity. That electricity relies on coal and gas and oil to generate the electricity. So our demand is now way back up. But supply is not. Not just supply is still low, but in fact, they decided to double down. OPEC back in 2020, to try and save the fact that they were literally paying people to take oil off of their hands, dropped their production by staggering amounts. I think it was like 65 or 70% reduction in production. Production. But our economies have bounced back. Our need for oil has returned. But OPEC hasn't. OPEC still has not increased their production since the COVID 2020 levels. They've raised it slightly, but not nearly as much as our economies, our global economies, and as our energy needs have warranted and required. And not just that. In OPEC's most recent meeting, some of the Arabic member countries couldn't agree on whether or not to increase production. Some countries wanted to overproduce. They wanted to not be limited by OPEC with how much OPEC wanted them to produce and for what price they were supposed to sell it at. They just wanted to be able to produce as much as they wanted to make a lot of money. Some of the larger member nations did not. So they got into a screaming match, essentially. A more business appropriate screaming match, back and forth. Raise it, no, raise it, no, raise it, no, no, raise it. Wait, what? No. Literally, they got into a giant argument. And the result of it was... there was no result. They literally just ended it with the argument, and no changes were made, and in fact, the monthly meetings that OPEC usually has, they suspended them. We don't know when OPEC is going to meet again. So, oil and gas shortages are huge. Prices are skyrocketing. OPEC can't agree on production numbers. You can see what what step number 4 is going to be here. Because we're getting out of the summer, into the fall, and soon after, winter. But before we get to the winter months where it's cold and we need heating oil, there first is going to be a few more heat waves. Most recently in China, there's been a heat wave for the past 2 weeks or so that have sent their energy needs sky high, about 50% higher than normal consumption levels. So China, the world's largest country, the world's largest producer, had a massive shortage of energy. Because of that energy shortage, many of the large energy consumers, such as factories and transportation companies, saw huge reductions in productivity, but also sky-high costs. Because the increased cost of transportation, remember, oil is not just used for heating and for energy, it's used for transportation too. So when the price for energy goes up, the price for transportation goes up too. That transportation cost makes it so that it's way more pricey to actually be able to get materials to a factory and then the finished products out of the factory. Now, what does that bring us to here? Where are we now? Because this leaves us in a very interesting place. On one hand, oil companies and the oil industry is thriving. They're doing great. Profits are going through the roof. But the increased need for energy has sent other types of materials sky high as well. Because what we're finding is that the low supply and extremely high demand for energy is causing coal and uranium to skyrocket. When we have less oil and less gas, they're going to rely on other energy sources to meet those demands. That's why thermal coal is one of the highest returning subsectors or industries at the moment. But it's also part of the reason that other industries are suffering due to the increased cost of materials and energy. And something to keep in mind here is that the US is not part of OPEC. We are not limited by what OPEC wants us to produce. So chances are in the US, we are not going to run into any natural gas or oil shortages anytime soon. We can always produce more to meet our own demand. But can't really do much else besides that. And we are still at the mercy of the global economy, where anything that affects China will eventually affect us because we are farther down the supply chain. And if China's production decreases, like we've seen with microprocessors in the past, those shortages will impact our production and what we have available to us as consumers. Let's now go ahead and let's look at oil and natural gas companies. There is going to be a ton of them, absolute ton of them. So let's go through them one by one. Well, most of the bigger ones, let's say. ExxonMobil, XOM. Chevron, CVX. Royal Dutch, there are both A and B shares, so RDSA and RDSB. PetroChina, PTR. BP. China Petroleum and Chemical, SNP. And Petróleo Brasileiro, PBR, and the voting shares, PBRA. These are all of the integrated. Besides that, we have Upstream. So these are only companies involved in the exploration and extraction. ConocoPhillips, COP. EOG. Canadian Natural Resources, CNQ. Pioneer Natural Resources, PXD. And then in the midstream, we have Enbridge, ENB. TC Energy, which is TRP. Kinder Morgan, which is KMI. And the Williams Company, which is WMB. And lastly, for downstream, we have Marathon Petrol, MPC. Phillips 66, PSX. Valero Energy, which is VLO. Sinopec Shanghai, which is a large downstream company from China, SHI, and Valvoline, VVV. And again, this is just a very small amount of what is out there. The last thing I want to do is talk about some of the biggest ETFs. Many of these industries we're going to run into will have multiple we'll have specific subsector ETFs. But because so much of energy is, well, petroleum, gas, and oil, oftentimes we'll find that there is not a lot of difference. But I'm just going to show you the oil and gas specific ETFs. So here we have United States Oil Fund, USO, Invesco DB Oil, DBO, United States Natural Gas, UNG, United States Brent Oil, BNO, State Street Spider, S&P Oil and Gas, Extraction, XOP, First Trust NASDAQ Oil and Gas, FXTN, and Van Eck Oil Refiners, CRAK, or crack. Lastly, let's talk here about the takeaways. The oil and natural gas industries are massive multinational industries that are dominated by international organizations or cartels such as OPEC and others such as OPEC but only for Arab countries that regulate the prices and production of oil to try and manage the supply to meet the demand in the market. Changes in oil gas demand, like we're seeing now, but also back in April, can lead to significant issues in the market with both dips and spikes in price. But right now, we are seeing energy skyrocket as global demand for oil and gas increase, but production is not raising to meet the demand. Instead, it's leading to a need not just for oil and gas, but for other alternative energy sources such as coal, uranium, and clean energy such as, or renewable energy sources like solar and wind as well. So that is what I have for you all today. Before we end today's webinar, there is one thing I want to mention. Many of you are aware that we are about to have a new class series launch with my mother, Julie Stav, and the Hira Solis team. Those classes will be made available for free to Sectors Made Simple subscribers. So if you're not a member already and you're interested in purchasing a subscription, right now is a great time because not only do we have the upcoming classes, but 1 month from now, so November 1st of this year, the cost for Sectors Made Simple will be increasing from $600 a year to $750 per year. We've had an incredible amount of growth in the past year, and we're incredibly grateful for the community that has helped us to get to this point. So as a reminder, as a thank you from us for your contributions and for your participation, if you purchase a subscription at whatever cost you get in at, as long as you have that subscription, your price will not change. So if you buy in at the $600 price, you have that $600 price forever. So now is a great time not just to take advantage of the upcoming class series, but to lock in your $600 price before the price increase on November 1st. If you're interested in purchasing a subscription and you're not sure how, you can come over to our website, sectorsmadesimple.com. You will need to log in first, so please log in first and then head over to the subscribe button. And here you can buy with Google Pay or Apple Pay, or click sign up and follow the steps on screen to purchase your subscription. If you run into any issues or have any questions, please send us an email at support@sectorsmadesimple.com and we can do our best to help you. But that is all the time we have for today. Thank you all so much for joining us for another very interesting subsector spotlight as we cover the industries behind various market activities and talk about how understanding not just the effects but the causes as well makes us understand the market a little bit simpler. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I look forward to seeing you all very, very soon. Take care.